All right, welcome everyone to today's FSMA Friday presentation on food labeling concerns and cures. This is a red hot topic, so I'm really excited to dig into some of the best practices that can be added to your plans and goals in the coming months. And we have a lot of new folks joining us today since it is such a hot topic, so welcome to FSMA Friday. This is our monthly series, and it's brought to you by Safety Chain and the Atchison Group, and it's designed to bring focus to current changes within the Food Safety Modernization Act and provide some expert advice on methodologies and tools that you can use to help ensure compliance. So before we begin, just a quick heads up, all attendee mics will be muted during the course of the presentation, but as always, we're leaving room at the end for your questions. So during the course of the presentation, please do submit your comments and questions using the webinar panel throughout the session, and we'll do our best to get through them. But if we do run out of time, we will absolutely follow up to any question that wasn't addressed during the Q&A section. One final note, as always, we're recording this presentation, so you can look forward to that coming to your email inbox shortly later after the presentation. We'll have the replay and the slides ready for you so you can review them and get back to us, of course, if you have any other concerns or questions. So I am excited to have back to FSMA Friday Mr. Cameron Prince, who has joined us over the years to share his experience on some international food labeling requirements and other topics like how GFSI measures up against FSMA Human Food Rule and many, many other topics. So welcome back, Cameron. Um, I know food labeling requirements are still very much a hot topic, so thanks for coming back to give us the latest labeling updates and how they have a ripple effect to those here on this call today. So would you mind giving us a little background before we begin the presentation?
Okay, yeah, thanks, Jim. And it's a great pleasure to be with you all today. Um, just a bit more about myself. I'm Executive Vice President of Regulatory Affairs for the Atchison Group. And I also have another handle there, which is a directing manager of TAG Canada, because I'm based in Canada, but I work all across North America. We do have global clients as well at TAG. So um, I've been with TAG about 8 years and have greatly enjoyed it. And uh, we our clients go across the whole spectrum in the food industry, mostly food manufacturers, mostly in Canada and the US. However, increasingly we're working with food companies in the Middle East, in India, and South America, and Asia as well. So it's the food industry is really a growing hotspot for sure, and it did not slow down during the pandemic. That's for sure. We actually got busier during that period of time, and I'm sure many of you experienced the same thing. So yeah, happy to talk about food labeling. It's certainly a hot topic. It probably always will be. It's a complex topic. I can't begin to cover everything today, but certainly I would like to give you a flavor of some of the things that you need to be aware of and to think about, and maybe look forward to the future a little bit, and also down to some nitty gritty about some of the things you can do as best practices in food labeling, particularly controls of food labels. So back to you, Jim. Do you want me to continue, or you got a bit more to say?
No, that's great. No, this is good. Just getting a little bit familiar about your background and TAG, and obviously we're ready to hear a little more about some of the more recent FSMA updates.
Okay. One of the first regulatory updates, and I'm sure all of you listening today, if you have anything to do with spices or ingredients and use sesame, you know all about this. So sesame is now the 9th uh, food allergen of significance as identified by the FDA. And that is creating some interest in the topic as sesame is imported to the US, and there have been a number of FDA actions with regards to sesame import. So that's of concern to many industries that use sesame seeds. So there's some new things to talk about there for sure. Just hot off the press in the last day or so, FDA has released a systematic literature review of food safety culture. I've had a quick chance to look at that. It is very much a literature review, reviewing mostly the academic literature around food safety culture. Um, it's, of course, food safety culture is the hottest topic these days, and it is a part of FDA's new era of food safety. So, of modern food safety. So, it's something, if you're interested in that topic, there is a link on the FDA website. We can provide that to you if you need it. And if it's something that your company is looking at, I definitely say have a look. More to come. We spend a lot of time on food safety culture at the Atchison Group, and yeah, it's something where companies are increasingly asking about food safety culture and how can it be assessed? Where do companies stand on the continuum of food safety culture, and how can they do better? So that's something that I think everybody in the food industry is interested in. And there are 2 FDA documents released on food allergen labeling requirements. I'm going to be talking about those in a bit more detail in a few minutes. So those are regulatory updates for today. Next, please. Okay, so what we're going to talk about is kind of a potpourri of various topics on food labeling with mostly a US focus, an FDA focus. There, of course, are other labeling concerns that are global, and there's also, of course, USDA labeling. I won't be talking about that today, mostly FDA. And so first, we're going to talk about FDA guidance on healthy claims. That is a new piece that has come out. So I just want to share with everybody a summary of what that's all about and foods that are qualified, etc. The big one, of course, is the FDA policy on on allergen labeling. This is their 5th version. It's in the form of questions and answers. It reflects the addition of Sesame, and it updates a whole bunch of other things, which I'll get into. So those who are interested in allergens or are having to control and label for allergens, it's very important that you get up to speed on this this new policy from FDA. And kind of following from that, in terms of allergen labeling, allergens continue to be the largest reason for recalls. And I just thought it would be good to take a little bit of time to go over things that can be done in a plant that may seem like overkill, but really they're needed if you are have products with allergens that need to be labeled and identified on those. And because overlooking an allergen on a label can be a very difficult thing for any company and for consumers. Then we're going to talk a little bit about front of package nutrition labeling. So I'll get into that, and that will lead us into a discussion about the Canadian implementation, which is now law in Canada for front of packaging labeling. So next slide, please. Okay, this is a proposed rule for healthy claims, and it came out in late September of this year. It was felt by FDA that the current definition of healthy, which goes back to, well, all the way back into the 90s, with some updates in the early 2000s, but it's time to have a look at that term and what that actually means as diets change and consumer expectations change, and commonly used foods has changed a great deal, and it was time to have a look at that. There's also the concern that it was perceived that some foods that were getting that healthy claim, in fact, weren't all that healthy. So FDA felt that they needed to move and update on this. So the current rules are based on limits for total fat, saturated fat, cholesterol, and sodium. And they must provide 10% of one or more of vitamins A, C, calcium, iron, protein, and fiber. So that's the starting point of where we are. Next slide, please. First off, it's important to remember that the use of the term healthy is voluntary, but obviously many companies want to use the term on their foods. This new rule is entirely aligned with the Dietary Guidelines for Americans, which is readily available and has been updated recently. So that is the basis for this in terms of those policy changes. Where this is going is that food products would need to contain a certain amount of food from at least certain food groups. And that includes fruits, vegetables, grains, dairy, and protein foods. So in order to be healthy, at the starting point, it has to be from one of those areas. There are more strict limits on added sugars, saturated fats, and they're based on daily values, or which are also based on serving size. So those two are the two parameters that are important, and some of those serving sizes and daily values have changed in recent years. And those of you who do a lot of labeling may know the details of that much better than I do for your particular products, but it comes down to being a mathematical calculation sometimes as to whether or not a healthy claim can be made. Next, please. So raw whole fruits and vegetables would automatically qualify for healthy claims. So we don't need to talk about that, but it's important to note. Next, please. All right, we're going to, that's it for healthy claims. Before we get started on this slide, there's good information on that on the FDA website. We're happy to clarify if you have any want to use healthy claims and what that might mean for your labels. So certainly we can entertain questions on that area. Okay, so now we're moving into another topic. This is updated guidance on food labeling requirements. And this has to do with allergens entirely. So this is update of the last edition, which is edition 4. So we're now edition 5. And it's based on the amendments to the FASTER Act, which is Food Allergen Safety Training, Education, and Research Act of 2021. And it is based on the Food Allergen and Consumer Packaging Act. That act, the former one, requires labeling of allergens in food. So that is the basis for all of this, is that act, which came into effect in 2004. Under that act, as I mentioned before, sesame was added to the list as the 9th major food allergen, and that is effective January 1st, 2023. So that there will be no transition period on that I'm aware of. That will come into effect right away. Of course, labeling, that'll be subject to some provisions to use up existing labels, but I think the tolerance around that will be rather limited. So I don't think the FDA is going to make you tear packages off the shelves necessarily, but as quickly as possible to move into that restriction of adding sesame to the contain list on the nutrition facts table. And there's a lot of questions around in this. This policy is really entirely about embedded in questions and answers, which is sometimes takes a little searching to get what you want, but most of it is there. And so Sesame obviously is added to the questions and to the labeling guidelines. I can just mention sort of an aside on Sesame that we've noticed FDA taking a lot of action on Sesame on import. And whether this is related, it's hard to say. It'd be pure speculation on my part, but we're certainly seeing a number of sesame exporters, South America, India, Central America, who are find themselves being tested quite a bit at entry, and they're being tested for salmonella and also for the presence of pesticides and agricultural chemicals. And a number of imported sesame's shipments have been detained and are put on import alert list. So if you're in that business of sesame, you probably know all about that, but just for everyone else's benefit, just to say that that is also going on. Next, please. It's just some details on this allergen update. In the past, there was some leniency and lack of requirements about allergens on bulk containers. And now it's very clear bulk containers must have the allergens declared just like all other packaging. And that is because it's to avoid having any cross-contamination or mistakes being made in terms of bulk products. So we're talking about large tubs, super sacks, that kind of thing, need some identifier to indicate that an allergen is present. There is clarification on groupings of fish considered allergenic. As you know, fish is an allergen. But there have been questions about certain fish, whether or not they are allergens, and FDA has provided quite a bit of detail, which I can't go into here today, but on species of fish, groups of fish, and just defining for sure whether or not you're dealing with an allergenic species of fish or not. So those of you in the fish and seafood business, take note. Be good to check on that, because it may turn out that there are some fish and seafood ingredients that you're using that may not, in fact, be considered allergens, although most will be. Pet food, drugs, and cosmetics are exempt from allergen requirements. And also foods for transportation or carriers like airlines, etc., railways, passenger railways, etc., ships, they are not exempt from allergen labeling requirements. Now, how far that's going to be taken, I don't think when you get well, they don't serve meals on airplanes very much anymore, unless, but when there are meals on airplanes, I think the menus will probably, they already do identify allergens, and they're very careful to exclude allergens a lot of times, but foods prepared in commissaries for transport carriers will also have to have allergens declared. Next, please. Just continuing with the list of foods that that would require that there might be some question about whether they need allergen declarations. There are foods that are genetically engineered that are actually producing proteins that, although they're not from they don't meet the milk category because they're not from a domesticated cow lactation. They're from, say, fermentation with a genetically engineered yeast is the sample that, or the example that FDA gives in their documents. Those kinds of things, because essentially it's equivalent to a milk protein and will have the same allergenic effect, so they must be declared. And the definitions of milk, eggs, tree nuts is outlined in more detail. And this is, in my opinion, long overdue, because the definition of milk and eggs is restricted to domestic cow milk. And of course, there are lots of other species of mammals that produce milk that where the milk is available commercially. And so some of those definitions have been broadened to other species. The same with eggs. The definition is restricted to domesticated chickens, and obviously there are eggs available from other species of birds. So That's been refined. And they have a new list of tree nuts. Obviously, there are hundreds of types of tree nuts, and we think of almonds, etc. But of course, there are and walnuts, etc. But there are many others, and they have a quite an extensive listing available now of what is a tree nut and what species of plant provide tree nuts. There's also new guidelines on precautionary labeling, and this has always been a bit of a controversial topic. This is the whole issue of may contain. Sometimes it says produced in a facility that handles peanuts, those kinds of things. And I think there's always been a FDA discomfort with that. I know I spent many years at the Canadian Food Inspection Agency and had lots of experience with this in Canada and with FDA. Regulators don't like it because they see this as a way potentially to avoid having to have good manufacturing practices. So they're very clear that it's okay in certain circumstances to have precautionary labeling about allergens on but it's no excuse for not having proper GMPs to make sure that sanitation and verification of the sanitation is there such that there's the likelihood of cross contamination is limited. Still, they recognize that obviously there are times when there is a chance of cross contamination, and even under the best conditions and controls that it can happen. So it is important to warn people that have severe allergens that this could happen, and they can avoid that product if they choose to take that and not take the risk. There are also allergen requirements on dietary supplements, allergen labeling declarations required. So they are not exempt, although the details of that are a little bit different, obviously, than typical food. All that to say is that there's a great deal of detail in this. If you're affected by this, have a look. If you or your industry association have concerns, comments are due by the end of next month. So I'm sure that FDA will hear a lot on this. So just to share that part with you. Okay, just checking our time here. I think we're okay. Let's go to the next slide, please. I wanted, as I said at the beginning, I want to talk a little bit about kind of into the weeds. So I apologize for that, but we see so many labeling mistakes causing companies to get themselves into food recalls. Not very often severe illnesses, but it does happen, and it's tragic. And it's again the number one cause for food recalls are simple labeling mistakes. They're not intentional. I haven't run across one yet where it was just like, oh, we don't need to bother doing it. It's just stuff happens in food plants, and it's human error, it's printing errors, there's lots of reasons for it. So this kind of thing happens in all types of companies. We see it in large and small companies, in very simple operations, less so because it's easier to control it, but the more complex the operations become in terms of many ingredients and many product lines, that's where you often get into to these mistakes being made. So quite often there's the exact same product being made in a plant, and one has an allergen and one doesn't. And there's just that risk that those labels get mixed up, and you have a recall on your hands. And it affects many commodities and processes. Of course, it's most often in manufactured foods, but it can be in dairy, ice cream, for example. We've seen several ice cream companies have problems with allergens coming in that they were unaware of in ingredients. In other words, the mistake wasn't made in their facility. The mistake was made where a supplier providing some ingredients didn't declare tree nuts and that ended up in the final ice cream product, and found out after the fact, unfortunately, that it was there and it was a mistake. So lots of things can happen. So attention to details, not just in the plant, but also in the supply chain, very important. Training and awareness among staff is super important. Inventory controls of labels, storage of labels, accountabilities of individuals that have to make sure that this is all correct. Online checks and vital product checks, possible critical control points, and shipping checks. So we'll talk on the next slide just in a little bit more detail on that. Next, please. Oh, okay. Just best practices. This is a very short list. There are many others. We in our practice find that sometimes not all of these provisions are built into the labeling controls. And you know, we're not just talking about allergens here. There are other reasons why labeling controls other than allergens can cause you grief. Even things that have nothing to do with food safety, such as country of origin. If you're packing tomatoes and you're using Mexican and US tomatoes and you're required to put the country of origin, and you put a Mexican product of Mexico or product of USA on a Mexican tomato. I mean, it's just an example that can cause you trouble as well, and potentially enforcement action. So it's not just about allergens. It's just that allergens are the most acute area where this is a problem. So even before we talk about inventory, quite often labels are made by a regulatory group, or they're developed with product development and a regulatory group in food companies. And that's where it all starts. So that due diligence in that area to get the labels designed and properly put together, and then with third parties that are actually printing and developing the labels, to make sure all of that is buttoned up very tight. And then once you have labels, having strict inventory control is really important. One of the classic problems that we see are old labels that get left in a label storage area. Somebody grabs them by mistake and throws them on the line, and now you have a problem, whereas could have been easily avoided if those old labels were just trashed as soon as they became out of date or no longer usable. Get rid of them. You really have to know what goes into the line and what comes back to storage. So quite often labels don't get, or most often labels don't get all used up. They go to the line in rolls or whatever, and a bunch of them are used, and then there's some left over, and then they have to come back to storage. And just that transition of bringing them to the line needs to be very strictly controlled. And then the inventory. And labels sometimes are not, you can't count them necessarily because they come on big rolls. Nobody's going to go and count every single one. So you got to go by weight or find some other good metric that works, that's verified, to make sure what goes out, what comes back, etc. It's a lot of detail, and it's sometimes a lot of extra work, but it can pay off. A secure storage. We recommend locked storage for labels. Some would think that's overkill, but you sure want to make sure that labels aren't just kind of migrating onto your line that you don't have control over. So very limited access and accountable staff, a few accountable staff that have access to that area and are authorized to check even before the label, when it's received, first off, to make sure it's right, and before it goes into use, and then when it goes to the line, that they're in control of issuing those labels to the line, and then somebody takes it to the line and make sure it's the right thing, and then have checks during the run initial, in the middle, end of run, and then verification by a supervisor. And then quite often after everything's packed up and so on, to have final product checks. It checks when you ship out. It's a lot of checks, I know, but it creates a system that can really avoid problems, and we're happy to advise if anybody has questions on that process. Next, please. All right, we're shifting gears a little bit because I said it's a very wide topic with lots of things going on. So I want to talk about front of package nutrition labeling, and this is not really a new idea. I was talking to David Atchison, our CEO, and back when he worked at FDA, and there was an initiative 10 plus years ago back then to look at front of package nutrition labeling. And the whole objective here is it's a public policy issue in terms of improving the health of Americans through more information on nutrition and helping people make better choices. So this is the big driver. It's hard to argue with, but it does put some pressure on food companies for sure. I know food companies want to do the right thing, but sometimes changing a ton of labels or sometimes identifying a certain nutrient can really detract from the appeal of a product. And we're going to be talking about this is happening in Canada. So there's some lessons learned that we could share before this gets too far in the US. So President Biden made an announcement in September 2022, this year, not long ago, indicating that this type of labeling where things like fat, sugar, etc., are identified very clearly right on the front of the package. So there's no mistaking it for consumers. So it will be prominently displayed and probably will involve some kind of readily visible logo or indicator that will indicate that the product is high in something or other, sugar, fat, etc. So this is part, as I indicated, of a broader healthy food initiative by the U.S. government. All of this is going to take congressional approval, of course, and so it'll go through the whole political system, and of course that takes time. So this is not going to happen tomorrow, and there will be plenty of opportunity to consult and input on it. But I just thought it was really important to mention it here today because I have no doubt that eventually it will come into effect in the U.S. And it's now mandatory in Canada. And of course, any of you and many of you export food to Canada, so are already aware of this. And you'll need to know this because it's a fact in Canada, but it could also be good for those who sell only within the U.S. to get ready to implement or think about it at least until it comes along. So next, please. So this is the kind of thing you could anticipate coming in the U.S. Well, it won't be exactly the same. I'm sure there'll be a different version, but the whole idea is there that this thing is going to be stuck on the front of the package and it's going to say, okay, high in saturated fat, it's high in sugars, high in sodium, and then there'll be an FDA logo or something indicating that this is a government identification that's mandatory on the front of this package. There will be, I can predict in the US, there'll be certain industry sectors that will be fighting some of this just because in some ways it can get unfair. I know that, for example, milk products all dairy products can sometimes be high in fat, yet there's a lot of advantages to dairy, calcium, etc. So that's an argument to say, well, why should we put high in fat when in fact this is providing health advantages? Another one that we saw in Canada was ground beef being higher than the standard or the threshold for fat, meant every package of ground beef in Canada was going to have one of these warning stickers on it. The beef industry pushed back because quite often ground beef is a mainstay in many diets, especially in families that maybe can't afford the higher priced protein sources such as steaks and so on. And so it's a staple, and there's not many other foods that are available, and this is a good place to get protein, etc. And it's in that sense, it's a healthy food. So there's pushback there. So those are just a couple of examples that are real life that we're experienced in Canada. And I hope they're helpful for you to think about this in the future. Next, please. So just go through some slides fairly quickly on how it worked in Canada. On July 20th of this year, the new regulations were passed in what's called Canada Gazette 2, which means they're essentially a rule, like the rule making in the US. And it's for prepackaged foods, so not for bulk foods. It's only prepackaged foods where the product exceeds thresholds of saturated fat, sodium, and sugars. And now there's a very long lead time on this, 3 years to change the labels. So that's means that the food industry has an opportunity to adjust, which is good. And it's all about, again, helping consumers making informed choices about prepackaged food. Next, please. So most prepackaged foods that exceed 15% of daily values of saturated fat, with daily values being the recommended intake of whatever it is, whether it's fat. So if it's 100 milligrams of fat, I'm just pulling that out of the air. If it exceeds 15% of that, then you get that triggers use of the symbol on the package that it's high in saturated fat. So that applies to sodium and sugar. There are some tweaks on this. I won't get into this in much detail here, but in some foods, the threshold is going to be lower, so down to 10%. And then sort of in the other exception is in some main meals, the threshold would be higher at 30%, but the typical food is going to be 15%. Is the trigger or the level at which you're going to have to use these symbols. Next, please. So exemptions to front of package labeling. The beef industry lobbied and succeeded in getting whole ground meats exempted. Alcoholic beverages are exempted. Fresh vegetables, whole eggs, and milk are exempt, and they're because they have health benefits that greatly outweigh any concerns about what fat or other nutrient might be present. Obviously, very small packages, it's just impossible to put more stuff on the label, so they're exempt. And cheese and yogurt are exempt because they're high in calcium content, and that has obvious health benefits. So there are some exemptions there, and there was a lot of behind the scenes pressure to get some of these exemptions put in place. Next, please. So I'm getting near the end of my time speaking here, so I just wanted to do a summary of where we're at with food labeling concerns in the U.S. particularly. As a general rule, labeling issues continue to change and become more complex. I know that it's a battle to keep up, even for us at TAG, because things are constantly changing and there's a lot of complexity to it. a real true labeling expert can then get into these details. These are rare folks actually. So there, it's something that I find a very challenging area of the food business, and I'm sure many of you share that view. Um, Allergens continue to dominate the discussion, and then nutrition also dominates the discussion, and then claims. The whole world of it's a crazy world. It sometimes is the wild, wild west when it comes to claims on foods, whether they be quite often they're health claims, and of course, people like to push the limit on that. And sometimes you can go out and see claims that probably should not be on certain foods. And there's sometimes not as much enforcement as some competitors would like. I know the FDA often receives trade complaints about from competitors who see another product that's got a claim on it that is clearly, if not non-compliant with the regulations, is just totally unreasonable. So it continues to be an area, and it's also an area where there's a lot of legal activity, of course, as well. So a focus on good operational practices for the actual application of labeling is needed. So it's important for senior management, in particular of food companies, to realize that. We're seeing that at TAG, where senior folks who are looking at things that are happening within their company, and everybody's concerned about pathogens, and particular microbial pathogens, and increasingly on toxins and so on. So there's a real focus on that. But sometimes the labeling part, it's not appreciated just how much effort has to go into this and how much diligence is necessary. So something that's good to remind ourselves of. And of course, mistakes can have serious consequences for consumers, for people with allergens. It can be devastating. This can affect brand reputation, and it can have broad financial impacts. And just a word, kind of in closing, on FDA enforcement on all of this. I think, no, again, you'll have to, this is me speculating, but it comes from a place of experience. Labeling non-compliance, sometimes it has not been as rigorous as other areas, and understandably so, because a lot of labeling non-compliance has nothing to do with food safety. So it maybe doesn't hit that higher priority for enforcement. But certainly if there's non-compliance related to a food safety issue, I think it's fair to say we could see stronger enforcement from FDA going forward. Certainly on allergens, they're all over that, and I can see this increasing in the future. So that's kind of my closing remark. That's we've got a bit of time left for questions. Hopefully I can answer them as best I can. If not, I will definitely go back to my colleagues and other sources and be able to answer some of your questions after the fact. So Jim, back to you. I hope my timing is okay.
Oh, it's perfect, Cameron. You are Johnny on the spot here. I loved it. Okay. We got a ton of questions actually. So, but thank you. This was a really good overview of what to expect, and some of those best practices that you shared were really good too. There's a lot of questions around enforcement. But before we get into those questions, I just wanted to clarify something. Ashley asked, the healthy claims rule, is that proposed, or is that finalized? And better yet, is it being enforced?
Uh, I don't think it's finalized. I'll have to double check. I should know that off the top of my head. I don't, but yeah, no, it's not finalized yet, and it's not being enforced yet.
Okay, good, good. So there's time there, Ashley.
Yeah.
So in terms of individually packaged items, Jane was asking if the requirement is based on the package of which the individually packaged items are in, or does it pertain to the actual individually packaged items?
Um, can you run that by me again? I'm not sure I understand. Sorry, Jim.
Yeah, no. What's the policy basically on individually packaged items if they're sold within a larger bag that is labeled?
Oh, I see what you're saying. Well, quite often in that scenario, those are really small packages. So, when you ask that question, I'm thinking like a bag of Halloween treats or something like that, where those packages are often exempt because of the size. I would say that that's a generalization that I can make. Although if they get to a certain size, and I can't think of what it is right now, they still require nutrition panels and allergen claims. But if they're really small, they don't. So, but the outside packaging is subject to all the regular requirements. So I hope that's getting at what you were asking.
I think so. All right. I'm gonna keep track on the questions if Jane comes back to see if we missed that question, but I think
Okay.
you answered it. Yep. All right. So this isn't exactly related to, we'll just say the labeling requirements, but I know we chatted about this before on FSMA Friday. Are you aware of any insights around the PFAS regulations and enforcement and how that might kind of maybe leak into labeling requirements?
Yeah, I'm not an expert on that. I think it will become part of labeling requirements, and uh, that's kind of you need a crystal ball on that one. Uh, but what I can say is anybody has detailed questions around that, anything to do with PFAS or toxins in foods in general, um, I can refer you to Brent Koblish, who's our resident toxicologist at TAG, and he will be able to answer any questions on that. But if you ask me from a labeling context, I think we're going to see action in that area. Um,
Yeah.
but it is a difficult area because the pressure to go to parts per trillion and so on and some of these things is pretty heavy duty, and there are many groups, the consumer groups, that would like to see that. But the FDA has to balance um, true, they have to stick to the science and the toxicology, and obviously when these things get to be infinitesimally low levels, you have to ask the question: Are they really toxins? So, but I am not a toxicologist, but Brent is, and any questions on that, we can help you out.
Absolutely. And yeah, we do have some resources here at Safety Chain we can also pass along on that with
Perfect.
with us working with Brent, who is excellent on that topic. So I agree. All right, some sesame related questions came in. Obviously, you had mentioned before that the FDA is taking a lot more action or proactive action on the import of sesame. So one question was around, do you think ethyl oxide in sesame is on the FDA's radar, similar to the recalls that are happening in the EU? Are you familiar with that?
A little bit, yeah, I am familiar with it. Yeah, I I hesitate to comment very much on that because it's not really my expertise, but I am familiar with a number of sesame importers in the US, and they are very aware of the issue and are super careful generally about that topic and try to avoid that um, ethylene oxide usage. But if the question is FDA aware of it? No, certainly they are. Whether they're putting a priority on that, I haven't seen that yet, but again, that is an area that I could look into a bit further. But that's just my off the cuff reaction is that
Mhm.
they're aware for sure, but they're not. I haven't seen much action on that front from
Okay.
FDA. Yeah.
Similar question in the one earlier about the packaged foods or smaller packaged foods. Do bulk foods in grocery stores require the sesame allergen labeling?
Bulk foods. Yes, if they're in a retail store, yeah, they will. I, I, I think what if you're talking about these stores where there's bins put out and you go with your little plastic bag and you scoop stuff out, they are labeled over the bins. They have to be. In terms of a bulk pack in a grocery store, you know, I, I mean, it depends on the type of package and type of food you're talking about, but I can picture a lot of different scenarios, but I would say as a general rule, they're going to have to be labeled. Yeah.
Hmm. I have a question here from Danielle. I want to make sure I say it right. Has there been any determination in theoretical nutrition facts versus verified NFP by an analyst?
Okay. Can you say that again, Jim? I got to process that.
Sure. Has there been any determination in theoretical nutrition facts versus verified NFP by analysis?
I'll have to get back on that one.
Okay, we'll mark that. We'll get back to you, Danielle. No problem.
Yeah, yeah,
Uh,
we can answer that for sure, but I would need some support on that answer.
no problem. We'll get that to you. You had mentioned the country of origin example. One question came in from Sandra. Does it have to be where the original food item comes from or where it is packaged and sold? So the example she gave was coffee beans.
Okay, we're getting into country of origin labeling. Gen and generally, um, coffee beans quite often the companies want to identify the country of origin, um, but it's not obligatory because most coffee is a blend of many countries of origin. So it's voluntary. You can put it on, but I don't think it's mandatory that you have to put the country of origin for coffee.
It's not mandatory. Okay, good.
No,
Yeah,
not
that
to my
was the question.
knowledge. No, it's not mandatory.
All right, another one here. If an item is classified as an allergen, like a palm nut, would the byproduct also be considered the allergen? So palm kernel oil, for example.
Well, the first answer is yes, but it's all about is the allergenic protein still in that oil? And uh, as you most folks know, like the soy oil, for example, is a common food ingredient. Um, it is not considered an allergen because it's so highly processed that the protein of concern has been denatured to the point where it's no longer an allergen. So it would depend on the palm kernel oil, just how refined it is. I don't know much about palm kernel oil, so
Right.
if it is a typical refined oil that's processed, it wouldn't require tree nut declaration.
Okay. How about nutraceuticals or dietary supplements? Is this are these regulations kind of impacting them as well?
Yes, the dietary supplements are included. Um, you'd have to look at the details, but yeah, essentially if there's allergens in dietary supplements, they have to be identified.
Okay. Elias just came in. What about hydrolyzed allergens? Are they required to be labeled?
Um, well, again, I'd have to get into the details of it. If they're hydrolyzed, then to me that means that the allergenic protein has probably been destroyed. So
Hmm.
probably not, but I'm just speculating on that. It really depends on the process,
Right.
but typically hydrolysis will break up protein. So yeah, I would think they would be exempt.
Overall, when going back to enforcement, there's obviously some new guidance that just got updated and then some finalized items as well. And just generally speaking, when should folks be absolutely prepared to meet these new compliance regulations? I know we had a couple of dates that were mentioned throughout this presentation, but uh, again, we're talking about enforcement. So what are your thoughts around that, generally speaking?
Uh, Well, if we're talking about those front of package labeling, it's 3 years in Canada and so U.S. companies exporting food to Canada's got 3 years to do that. When it comes to these sesame, it's going to be immediate if
Mhm.
it's there. Um,
And the allergen regulations?
um, well, those those are not really regulations. They're kind of they're a rule or a guidance, I should say. Pardon
Mm,
me. So um, I think there's going to be a transition period on that. Um, but again, it's guidance, so I can't really talk about. Technically, they don't enforce on guidance. They
okay.
enforce, yeah.
All right, Michael asked a question. I'm going to do my best to interpret this. Is there sort of a lifespan of a nutritional label?
Um,
Is there a requirement around, hey, every, I don't know, 3 months you need to update your nutritional labels with the latest, or is it based on
no,
obviously when there's changes within the actual ingredients or what have you?
well, if you change the ingredients, then you have to change all your
Right.
labels. So,
But
so that
no requirement to update the
no,
actual labels.
no. If you've
Okay.
got a simple food and you've got the format, the required format, nutrition label, and nothing's changed, and it's been 5 years, there's no obligation to change it. It's perfectly fine. They don't have a shelf life if they're. It's all about whether they're compliant or not. But again, if you if the rule changes and the format of the table changes, or you have an allergen in there, then or a new allergen comes into effect and it's in the product, there's any number of reasons why you might have to change your nutrition label. It's a good idea, and I should have mentioned this as a best practice to review those, um, say on an annual basis, just to be sure. Um, Sometimes formulations get changed and ever so subtly, and you know, it's the same product, but there may be a little bit more of this, a little bit less of that in the product. And you have to make sure that your nutrition label is up to date, because if you put a little less sugar in, your percentage values are going to change. If you add something that has fat in it, you've got to increase that. There's many, many reasons to change a
Mm.
nutrition label. So if you don't change anything at all and it's perfectly good, then you can go on forever. Well, until they change the rules, it's fine. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, and this was sort of kind of a we'll just say a general question around, is there a requirement that you do have to update your label and maybe, document that every so often? Yeah.
No.
Um, we are kind of running out of time. I'm just going to ask one general question here around, when the Atchison group, you and yourself and your colleagues go into plants and you're talking to folks around labeling best practices, what's the common one that you generally see? Is it the fact that maybe labels haven't been updated timely enough, or some old labels kind of leaked into the batch? Like, what are the biggest culprits in terms of label issues?
Well, I think yeah, the biggest thing is lack of control,
Hmm.
particularly in the allergen world. Um, I hate to say this, but we've seen some pretty sloppy operations in terms of label controls. And then we've seen the very best where there's um, great controls. Now, typically, it's human nature. The ones with a lot of controls are probably the ones that have had a problem, and they had to take steps to correct it. There are companies too. We have several larger clients that are being proactive. They're saying, we've had a few incidents, we've had a few close calls. Let's get at this, and they ask us for advice on how to improve those practices so that they avoid any risk of labor. So that it's typical, just plain old operational practice. Um, the other thing that we see sometimes is that the labels have not been vetted properly in the first place. Um, it's always wise to have really rigorous and sometimes outside advice on a label, especially where they're pushing the limits of claims and so on. That it's sometimes good to have outside advice on that kind of thing. But again, I repeat, the most of it is operational issues that we run into, and then we get a lot of questions about ahead of time. Companies want to know, well, we got this label. This is what it looks like. You think it's okay? We do that a lot.
That sanity check. You got it. All right. I'm going to apologize to some of the questions that have come through. Folks, we will get back to after this session. Cameron, stand by. I've got some questions coming your way to follow up with.
Okay,
But
great.
love the discussions. We're going to definitely continue this conversation throughout the coming months here. Thank you, everybody. If you have other questions around anything FSMA related, of course, you can contact the Ashton group. They have some resources that you can tap into, as well as Safety Chain. We have a full repository of thought leadership documents, things like PFAS that we were talking about. There were some mentions of links from the FDA and other resources. We will provide that to you in our follow-up today. So please keep a lookout for those links as well, because I know some of you had requested those. So thanks everybody for joining us. I hope you have a wonderful holiday season, and definitely plan to join us in the new year for some more FSMA Friday fun. We'll see you later. Thanks, Cameron.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Okay, take care, everybody.